Namaskar. In number 31 session, we will be discussing about international trade theory. You have to understand that trade is a part of international business and international business is a part of international financial management. The earning, spending of foreign currency, significant part coming from the international trade side, and where trade take place, what is the theory behind the international trade, how over the year the trade theory has changed should also be a part of international financial management, and we will be discussing about various theory of international trade, starting with the classical theory, then we will migrate to what is called recent development in trade theory, that is the new trade theory agree. Then we will discuss about the relative Huxley theorem, then we will also discuss about the Porter's model of competitive advantage, and also we will be discussing about the trade barriers, which are the factors which actually hamper the trade barrier and how we can improve the international trade by removing the trade barriers. Let us start with the international trade theory. What is actually international trade? International trade nothing but exchange of goods and services beyond the national boundary. And if you see, the international trade is as old as the human civilization itself. From the days of human civilization there has been trade. Trade may be exchange of goods and services in the barter system, one goods for another goods. After the development of monetary unit, particularly the gold standard or the paper currency standard, the international trade further developed. Development of transport, communication and the international currency market help in growth of the international trade. Differences, why international trade will be there? That will because all different countries are not endowed with natural resources, equally endowed with natural resources, they are not endowed with specialization. So, the specialization differences, the differences in endowment of natural resources, differences in the production process lead to development of international trade. The classical trade theory focus on absolute cost advantage as the determinant of international trade, because two countries, one country produce particular commodity or goods as cheapest way and another country cannot produce the same compared to other country, there will be exchange of goods and this exchange of goods lead to international trade. Recent development in trade theory explain the link among natural country advantage, government action, industry characteristic as the enablers of international trade. The enablers are not the only absolute cost advantage, but also the government policy, the subsidy, the government intervention in international trade, the development of countries natural resources, the scientific R&D development, the innovation, all these contribute, all these are enablers of international trade. Let us start with the international trade theory, the classical trade theory. If you see the classical theory, classical belief in free trade policy, there should not be any kind of barriers in international trade, there should not be any kind of restriction in international trade. Free trade should be the best, should be the ideal policy to improve the international trade. When there is a free trade, it is the absolute cost advantage that actually design the free trade policy. Both goods and services, human specialization should be allowed to move freely without any restriction, and on this basis the classical theory developed the theories of international trade. If you see, the earliest form of classical theory is a mercantile theory of 16th century. The mercantile belief in what is called the trade between two country, because when there is trade takes place between two country, one country is loser, another country is a winner. So, the country which export is the country is the winner, the country which pay for the export, these are the country is a loser. These are the what is called the baseline of trade as per the mercantile theory. They thought that international trade cannot be mutually beneficial. Hence, there is the one country will loser, another country will the winner in international trade. It is better to produce everything as far as possible, they thought that, and it is negative aspect of international trade. Mercantile theory is a negative aspect of international trade. Only should import whenever you are not in a position to pay, not in a position to produce it. There is no linkage of cost here. You can produce something with highest possible cost, but same goods are available in the international market at cheapest way. You should import that good rather than producing it, but mercantile did not believe on that. They thought international trade is a negative aspect, and international trade only the country which export is the winner. This is actually negative aspect of international trade, and this has been corrected by the classical theory of other classical theory, that is particularly the Adam Smith. Adam Smith in his book what is called The Wealth of Nation in 1776 discussed about the international trade, and he developed the policy what is called absolute cost advantage. Absolute cost advantage is the primary determinant of international trade. A country should specialize in production and export product for which it has absolute cost advantage. The country should not produce a particular product in which the country does not have an absolute cost advantage. If some other country can produce the commodity at cheapest possible cost, the country should import that commodity rather than producing it. Import of other produce, they should export that commodity where it has absolute cost advantage, and the import and export should be on the basis of absolute cost advantage. This leads to productive utilization of resources, and country would be beneficial in particular goods in the world market. So, they thought a country should always be competitor in the international market by producing particular good on the basis of absolute cost advantage. So, the country should produce the good where it has absolute cost advantage, import other good where it does not have absolute cost advantage. But this mercantile theory or the absolute cost advantage theory of Adam Smith forget about what is called comparative cost advantage. The principle of political economy, David Ricardo introduced the concept of what is called comparative cost advantage. A country should produce such goods and services where it has comparatively cost advantage. The country may be in a position to produce comparatively lower cost of production all goods and services that only they produce, other goods they should import. So, David Ricardo in his book Principles of Political Economy in 1817 described about the comparative cost advantage as the basis of international trade. Countries should specialize in production of those goods in which it has relatively more productive, even if it does not have absolute cost advantage in production. So, production should take place or international trade should take place on the basis of not on the basis of absolute cost advantage, but on the basis of comparative cost advantage. Similarly, the other theories here, the Hexer-Ohlin theory in 1919 and 1933. Hexer-Ohlin developed the principle what is called factor endowment principle, the factor endowment theory. If you see the world, different countries have different kind of factors of endowment. Here factors of endowment, particularly natural resources, you can call factor of labor, capital, technology, these are factor of production, land, the factor of production. Some country may be cheaply endowed with what is called capital, some country may be cheaply endowed with labor resources. So, countries should focus on the utilization of factor of production and to produce that good and commodity where it has a absolute cost advantage in production or factors that allow them to produce it. So, differences in factor endowment, not on the difference in productivity that determine the international trade. So, what are the factors? The factors of production are the labor, capital, technology, land, resources, these are the factor of production. The factor of production are not uniformly distributed across the globe. Some countries are cheaply having labor resources, some countries are having more capital resources. A country should produce that commodity which is their factor of production allow them to produce and exchange for other commodity. So, labor endowed country should produce labor intensive products, goods and services, and capital intensive country should produce capital intensive goods and services. The degree and nature of factor endowment decide the international trade or the pattern of the international trade. So, differences in the factor endowment is the policy on which international trade develop, and different country have different kind of capital goods, different kind of factor on and different kind of trade pattern. Like US having a capital intensive country, their country is producing, the country should produce capital intensive good. Developing country like India, China, they are labor intensive country, they should produce labor intensive goods and services, and there should be exchange of this kind of goods and services in the international market, and international trade should develop on the basis, generally develop on the basis of factor endowment theory. However, the Hexarollin theorem, when you actually utilize in recent days, there are some number of drawbacks are there. The drawback is here what is called Leonti paradox. Leonti, an economist in 1948, that time he used the actual data of US and tried to find out whether Hexarollin theorem is the basis of international trade. Does factor endowment theory decide the pattern of international trade, or there are some other factors or other theories are there? Research have shown that capital intensive country are exporting labor intensive product and they are importing capital intensive goods and services. So, this is the drawback of international trade as per the factor endowment theory. So, factor endowment what actually mention, the capital intensive country should produce capital intensive good and export this, labor intensive country should produce labor intensive goods and export it. When actually found in a US context in 1948, Leonti found that despite being a capital intensive country, the US is relatively US is importing labor intensive good, capital intensive good. So, what are the factors behind it? Why US as a capital intensive country is importing capital intensive goods and services? So, what is the reason behind it? The explanation may be different. This explanation leads to what is called Leonti paradox. So, US has a special advantage on producing new product made with innovative technology. These may be less capital intensive till they reach the mass production state. Technology may reduce the capital intensive nature of production process. So, US is an innovative country. Innovation has been taking place in US in large significant amount. When initial phase of innovation with the production is capital intensive nature. After the production process reached after the production process reached to a sufficient level, the US didn't produce the goods and services again. They transfer the technology, transfer the production process to other country, particularly the developing country side, and try US again import that goods and services which are maybe capital intensive in nature. However, US give more importance to more innovation and development of technology, development of R&D, development of innovative product which are more capital intensive in nature, and import these goods and services after transferring the technology to developing country. So, US may be developing country, US may be a capital intensive country, may be importing capital intensive good also. If you see the computer sector, the personal computer developed in US as a innovative product. Initially, US produced the computer and export to other country. After some time, when US realized that now time has come, this product has achieved the saturation level, US transfer the technology to developing country. Now, developing country side, particularly India, China, other country, they are producing, they are manufacturing computer and exporting to US. Despite US is a capital intensive country, importing computer which is capital intensive goods and goods. So, because US has achieved the level of saturation and US has achieved after innovating the product, transfer the technology to the developing country where mass production taking place at cheapest possible cost. So, the production side Leonti paradox is Leontief production mentioned that despite it is not the factor endowment theory that capital intensive country only can produce capital intensive goods and labor intensive country only can produce labor intensive good. It is not the factor endowment theory, because it is the mass production facility, innovation of product, scientific development, R&D activity, productivity that decide the international trade. On the basis of Leontief argument, recent theory developed what is called the relative change factor endowment theory. Relative factor endowment theory, particularly the factor endowment vary among country. Products differs according to type of factor that they need as inputs. A country has a comparative advantage in producing product that intensively use factor of production resources it has in abundance. Factors of production are the labor, capital, land, human being, technology, everything, and these are the factor of production. The technology and the risk capital decide the nature of the product production process, and country despite being a labor intensive product country may export capital intensive country. A capital intensive country despite capital intensive nature may import capital intensive good also, because it is not the factor of endowment only decide the nature of production or international trade. There are many other factors which decide the nature of international trade or pattern of the international trade. This lead to the development of what is called new trade theory. There are number of new trade theory. One such theory is the Venom theory. New trade theory propounded by the Venom product life cycle theory. And when you discuss about new trade theory, you should understand that specialization and economics of scale reduces the unit cost of production and provide comparative advantage. Specialization and scale production demand support a few company like automobile and aircraft industry. Companies get fast mover advantage and create large entry barrier for others to enter and thus command the market. The company when become a innovative company, when a fast mover company create excessive what is called trade entry barrier. So, other country or other company cannot enter, and they create a comparative advantage command the market. Similarly, firm with large gain during the initial period of products operation create high competitive advantage in the form of intellectual property right, in the form of R&D expenditure, economics of scale and scope, experiences, and create artificial barrier for other company to enter into the production process and compete with them, and they only can command in international trade market. So, international trade is not only depends upon the factor endowment, but also some other factor, the factor what is called intellectual property, R&D expenditure, economics of scale, scope, experience, technology, productivity, fast mover advantage and entry barrier. These are the other variable which also influence international trade and decide the pattern of the international trade, whether a country is export oriented country or a country is a import oriented country. That possibility not depends upon the what is called endowment factor of endowment only. So, if you see the new trade theory, one part of the new trade theory is the international product life cycle theory that developed by Vernon. The product life cycle theory was developed by Raymond in response to the failures of the Hexa-Rollin theorem in explaining what actually observed in real life international trade pattern. The theory suggests that early in a product life cycle, all the parts and labor associated with the product come from area in which it was invented. A country when invent a product, the capital, the labor come from that country only, and after the product become adopted and used in the world market, the production gradually moves away from the point of origin to other country. In some situation, the product becomes a item for the as imported by the original country where it was invented. A commonly used example in this context we can say the invention, growth and production of the computer with respect of the USA. The computer developed in USA with the labor forces of USA with the capital intensive capital of the US. When the capital when the US developed the computer, produce in mass and consume it, after that it pass the technology to other country. The developing country, a labor intensive country, they produce computer, they manufacture computer using the innovative idea of USA and exported that product to US itself. Despite a computer is a capital intensive goods developed by USA initially, US has become an imported country for that goods. This is actually called the international product life cycle theory. The product life cycle theory is here the model demonstrated dynamic comparative cost advantage, because initially it was the comparative cost advantage initial innovation phase, the US developed the computer, the mass production allow them to be a comparative cost, because other country imported from that. USA was the only country commanding the world. But however, after some time the comparative cost advantage was not there with the USA for production of computer. So, computer the technology shifted to developing country, emerging market economy, they develop computer, manufacture computer and suppose and US was imported to import country. The country has the competitive advantage in production of the product, changes from the innovating country to the developing country, what is called the international product life cycle, a dynamic dynamic competitive cost advantage. So, US as a innovating country enjoy from the initial product life cycle, after the maturity product life cycle achieve the maturity, it is a developing country, they get the benefit and they get the benefit, US become a imported country for the production of for the computer side. So, the international product life cycle theory develop what is called the maturity or dynamism of the competitive cost advantage, and the innovating country become a importer country later part of the production life cycle, product life cycle. So, here to understand that stages of the product life cycle, the international product life cycle pass through different phases. To understand the phases here, the phases is here first phase, what is called introduction phase. The introduction phase, the new products are produced to meet needs and new products are first exported to similar country, the country with similar needs, preferences and income level. Second stage is the growth phase. The growth phase, a copy of the product is produced elsewhere and introduced home country to capture the growth in the home market. This moves production to other country and usually on the basis of cost of production. The period till the maturity stage is known as the saturation model. Now, because of the cost of production need to be reduced, the developing country with a low wage country, they reduce that particular good innovative product at cheapest possible cost, and the maturity stage or saturation stage of the product life cycle, the product transfer from the innovative country to other country, and the other country now the major player and produce the product at cheapest possible way, then the country which actually produced or innovated the product in the earlier stages. The industry, the second stage, the third stage is the maturity stage. The industry contract and concentrate, lowest cost producer win the race, because lowest cost producer only can, because market is now reduced. So, in a reduced market you have to produce the cheapest possible cost, the cost of production need to be reduced further. So, the market here with the contraction of the product the industry, the market become lowest cost producer win the race. And fourth stage is the saturation point, this is a period of stability, the sale of the product reach the peak and there is no further possibility to increase. marketer must try to develop new and alternative use of product. Here the saturation point is reached, you have to develop the new usages of the product, so that you can market can further sale can be produced, can be possible in the same market. Stage 5 is the declining phase. Poorer country constitute the only market for the product, and the new country actually innovate the product, has to start a new product to develop a new market for it. So, innovation is a continuous phenomenon. Only innovation can provide a command over the market. An innovative country only command in the international trade setup. So, product life cycle theory is the international product life cycle theory explains that production process and the product has a own life. The life of the product decides on the basis of the uses of the product on the basis of cost of production of the product, and initial phase despite being a it is a capital intensive product, the country which innovate the product enjoy for a few years of the product life cycle. A later part of the product life cycle enjoyed by the poorer country or the country which has a lowest cost advantage, and this is the product life cycle theory, and the product life cycle theory always try to explain that innovation is only provide a first mover advantage to in the international trade pattern. If you go through the international trade, there are different cost advantage process. A Porter in 1990 developed what is called competitive advantage, and competitive advantage is a factor of endowment. Here land, labor, capital, workforce, infrastructure, all these are factors that when country which endow with all these factors, they get the competitive advantage. Second part, demand condition, like the demand condition like sophisticated large market, sophisticated domestic consumer base, offers innovative friendly product, environment, testing ground, these are the demand condition. The demand condition also provide first mover advantage or competitive cost advantage. The third more important related and supporting industry, local supplier, cluster of production process, and also help in innovation process. The most important is a firm strategy, structure and rivalry. Competition, national government subsidy activity, government condition, government helping nature, lower taxes, lower tax, mature condition also provide some kind of strategy for the company to beat the market. So, factor endowment, demand condition, supporting strategy, supporting industry, cluster of production process, farm strategy, these are the Porter advantage. Porter in 1990 provide some, these are the advantage for competitive cost, and this advantage provide some kind of benefit to the industry which have this kind of endowment facility, and they only command over international trade and decide the trade pattern in actual international market. If you see the factor endowment side, land, labor, some extent workforce, these are the developing country having large market, sophisticated consumer base, the developed country is having local supplier, cluster production, these are decided by the market forces. Similarly, government liberalization measure, government control, these are decided by the government policy, all these together decide the competitive advantage in international trade setup. If you go beyond that, there are many kind of trade barriers are there which also influence the international trade. When we discuss about trade barrier, you have to understand that international trade has own development process. Prior to during the first or second world war time, we can call up to first world war time, international trade was free in nature. There was no trade, no significant trade barrier. After second world war, many countries got their independence, they started developing their own country as for the development of the socialist idea, the communist idea. They thought it is better for the country to produce everything, they depended upon the country to provide more importance to domestic industry. So, in this line they created what is called artificial trade barriers. The trade barriers are in the form of high tariff, high custom duty, also not allowing the domestic or international trade in a large scale. The trade barriers has a more own economic region, because they wanted that their own domestic industry should not suffer because of international trade. The domestic industry may be infant in nature, and they need protection just like a child need a protection. So, after maturity they should be allowed to trade in international level. So, to protect the domestic industry, to protect the domestic labor forces, to protect the domestic resources, many countries practice what is called international trade in a high tariff barriers environment. This high tariff barrier environment or international trade barrier created and destroy the international trade in early period of particularly in early at 1950 or 60, and realizing this general international level international economists decided that there should be a forum to reduce the trade barrier for through negotiation process, and this negotiation started in the form of what is called a international institution. The institution known as you discussed earlier, GATT, General Agreement on Trade and Tariff. The GATT was established in 1948 and tried to negotiate among the country to reduce the trade barrier, and this GATT continued till early 90, and over the period many countries reduced their trade. I have reduced their trade barrier. However, trade barriers were significant till 90, and it was in the form of what is called custom duty, high custom duty in the form of what is quota system, and this trade barrier affected the smooth progress of the world trade. And after 1990s, WTO was established, and WTO addressed the issue of trade tariff, trade and trade negotiation process. When you discuss about international trade and international trade barrier, you have to understand there are two different kind of trade barrier. One barrier is called linked to tariff, another barrier what is called non-tariff barrier. When tariff barrier in the form of import export, non-tariff barriers are tariff barriers may be in the form of what is called custom duty on import export. Non-tariff barriers are maybe many things, maybe in the form of quota system on for import export, maybe in the form of license for export import, maybe in the form of trade subsidy, maybe in the form of voluntary export restriction. So, these are the called artificial trade barrier to reduce the international trade and provide some kind of revenue earning sources. When international trade was linked to revenue earning, it was a tariff barrier that was providing revenue to the in the form of export import duty, but revenue is not the only source of international trade. Revenue was behind that to restrict the international trade, the tariff was imposed. If you discuss about the different kind of tariff barrier, if you understand that there are many tariff barrier was primarily imposed by a developing country for revenue region, many tariff barriers primarily imposed by the developed country to protect their own industry. But after WTO agreement in early 90s, developing country together, they decided that in a phased manner the tariff barrier should be reduced to minimum level. Initially it was nearly 300% tariff barrier, it has been reduced to nearly 30% nowadays, and over the period negotiations has been taking place in goods, services, both agriculture, non-agriculture, manufacturing, mineral resources, other goods and services, technology export, capital export, investment, R&D activity, all these are part of the negotiation process to reduce the tariff barrier. However, after the WTO agreement, tariff barrier has reduced significantly. However, non-tariff barrier has increased significantly in recent days. The non-tariff barriers are the major issues and WTO negotiation process at present. You have to understand that which are the non-tariff barriers. Non-tariff barrier in the form of developing countries are having child labor The child laborers are working in developing country, they are producing goods and services for export purpose. The child laborers are paid very low wage. So, developed country are using the name of child labor, they are creating obstacle for the developing country export. Similarly, labor issue, developing country cheap labor resources are available, they are paying less labor wages are labors are less costly, they are producing goods and services for export as the cheapest possible way, but this is not available in developed country. Developed country using the policy of protection of their own labor, protection of their own industry, labor wage policy they are using in the context of creating non-tariff barrier for export of developing country. Similarly, for outsourcing protection, developing country are labor intensive country, they are having surplus labor, they can outsource, they are using the outsource activity of developed country or develop and providing the services of outsourcing services are getting good amount of export through their labor policy. However, developed country are criticizing the outsourcing policy and cheap labor policy of developing country and creating artificial barrier for export of labor human resources. Similarly, in the name of climate, in the name of chemical, in the name of environment, the artificial trade barriers are being created by the developed country. National security on another region, they are also imposing trade barrier on this issue. These are the non-tariff barrier has increased recently very heavily, and this non-tariff barrier are creating conflict in WTO agreement process, and WTO as a forum of negotiation of non-tariff barrier is not in a position to address this issue. Developed country through their excessive excessive exports and muscle power, they are ruling in the WTO forum, and they are creating artificial barrier in the form non-tariff issues and creating some kind of obstacles in the smooth process of international trade. If you see what is the requirement for the economic effect of the non-tariff barriers, why there should be tariff and non-tariff barrier, any economic regions are there for tariff and non-tariff barrier. So, primarily if you see in a developing country side, the non-tariff barrier is a artificial barrier which affect their export import, and these are affecting their economic progress. Or on the developed country side, the non-tariff barrier is a major issue to protect their own industry, create jobs for their own people. These non-tariff barriers is essential for them to protect their own industry, own labor policy, national security, their export. These are the non-tariff barrier for them to protect their industry. However, non-tariff barriers, they are developing countries are complaining that developed countries are complaining that jobs are destroyed because of trade. Workers' wages are hurt because of trade. Special industry with unique substantial economic activity should be protected. Potential will not mature without protection of industry. So, unfair competition undermines the benefit of trade. These are the economic reason. Jobs are destroyed by trade. Whether jobs are being destroyed by trade, you have to analyze this concept. This is a developed country using the non-tariff barrier, because they cannot use as agreement of tariff WTO, they cannot use the tariff barrier. They are using non-tariff barrier because they want to protect their job of their own people. Worker wages are hurt because of trade. Developing country cheap labor policies are producing goods and services at cheapest possible cost. So, they are exporting the world market, they are commanding the world market, but same kind of goods and services developed country are not getting the benefit, because their workers are highly paid wage. So, they are complaining that workers wages need to be protected, and for this trade are being international trade is destroying the job workers benefit. National security is threatened because of international trade. There also, because goods and services which are IPR region, intellectual property region, they are also affecting because of international trade. These are unfair protects tariff, non-tariff barriers, and these are non-competitive in nature. Long run, these are not going to help the world trade, and this non-tariff barrier should be discussed in a WTO environment and try to reduce the non-tariff barrier, try to remove this non-tariff barrier for the smooth progress of the world trade. These are the primary issue WTO should discuss, because on tariff barrier there is no economic region for non-tariff barrier. However, developing country should get the protection and in the WTO side, because the non-tariff barrier is destroying their export side. If you when you discuss the tariff, non-tariff barrier and world trade pattern theory, these are the ideal side for discussion, and you can go through the book International Economics Theory and Policy by Paul Krugman and Ostfeld. They discuss the recent development in trade theory and discuss the international trade as a policy for the smooth progress of world trade. And these books is nicely discuss about the recent development in trade theory. You can go through the book and try to understand that the international trade part, the development of international trade theory, and also tariff, non-tariff barrier, how it is affecting the international trade discussed in this theory. Second, for some model question I have developed for you. The model question is here: describe the importance of classical trade theory and bring out its relevance in present day practice. Here you discuss about the classical theory. The classical theory start with the why the classical theory believes in what is called free trade policy. The classical theory is a theory of absolute cost advantage, theory of comparative cost advantage, absolute cost advantage of Adam Smith. He mentioned that there should be countries should produce goods and services where it is absolute cost advantage, and imports goods and services where it does not have absolute cost advantage. Absolute cost advantage is the primary determinant of world trade as per the Adam Smith theory of absolute cost advantage. David Ricardo mentioned the comparative cost advantage. Countries should produce goods and services where it has comparative cost advantage. You can produce goods and services which are cheaply possibilities are there, cheap production process, and export goods and services where it has comparative cost advantage, and import goods and services where it has comparative cost disadvantage. And comparative cost advantage and disadvantage is the primary determinant of international trade as per the Ricardo. Then they also discuss about the theory of Hexer-Ohlin. He has mentioned that about what is called the factor endowment theory. The factor endowment is factor of production, that is land, labor, technology, resources, specialization decide the international trade. Here the Hexer-Ohlin mentioned about what is called factor endowment. The country which is labor intensive country should produce labor intensive goods and services. Those countries which are capital abundant countries should produce capital intensive goods and services and try to exchange these goods in international trade. It is a factor endowment that decides the international trade rather than the absolute cost and or comparative cost advantage. So, however, factor endowment theory is not practiced in real world. If you analyze the real world theory, real world it is the theory what is called the specialization, the factor the specialization, the productivity, technology, R&D activity, comparative cost advantage, and the what is called your scientific development, that decide the first mover advantage, and that decide the international trade. You can discuss the irrelevance of this present day practice. Present day practice, the classical theory is irrelevant, because real world it is not the cost advantage and factor endowment, it is not the absolute cost advantage, it is not the comparative cost advantage that decide the international trade. There are many other factors decide the international trade. Outline the importance of modern trade theory. Here we describe the international product life cycle theory, that comparative advantage theory of Porters. Here you describe the international trade theory, international product life cycle theory despite the initial innovation R&D activity, innovation R&D activities, scientific development, technological advantage that decide the international trade theory. Then initial phase of innovation, the innovating country get the benefit, later part of the innovation, later part of the product development, after the product developed, the later part the country may not get the cost advantage, and because some other country produce the same product at the cheapest possible cost, and only innovation decide the modern theory of international trade. We also discuss here the modern theory of comparative cost, comparative advantage of Porter, the Porter of endowment of resources endowment, technological endowment, the endowment of strategic principle. We can also discuss about the Porter's guidelines on the government policy that decide the international trade in real life. The third example is the third question is here the competitive advantage, specialization, intellectual property right, and economies of scale and scope decide the pattern of modern trade. You articulate this statement. We have discussed that the trade theory developed from the absolute cost advantage to comparative cost advantage to specialization, intellectual property, economies of scale and scope, and all these factors contribute in modern trade theory. You have to identify each factor has its own advantage, because trade theory, trade is not the country may not be in a position to produce everything. A country may not be in a position to produce everything at cheap possible cost. Country should not only endow with all kind of resources, so but they should go for the international trade. The international trade decide the pattern of international trade decide on the basis of capability, on the basis of fast mover, on the basis of advantage of specialization, on the basis of intellectual R&D activity, on the basis of economies of scale and scope. The large production, large base production, the high scale of production may reduce the unit cost of production, that provide cost advantage in the real life. So, all these factors decide the international trade. At the same time, like innovating company or a country always get the fast mover, and this fast mover allow them to create what is called high tariff barriers, high entry barrier for other industry to other company to enter, other country to enter. In this process, they command the international trade. All these factors decide the international trade, and trade pattern not only decided by the absolute cost advantage or comparative cost advantage, but also decided by the government policy. Government policy primarily the government taxation policy, government subsidy policy, government policy for infrastructure facility, these also decide the international trade. Many country have natural resources, many country have endowed with different kind of specialization, but they are not the winner in the real world. The real world depends upon the activity of government, activity of control regime. The government is controlling the trade, then with high trade barrier, then government cannot decide high tariff barriers to protect their own industry. This also affect the smooth progress of the world trade. So, when you discuss about modern form of world trade, the competitive advantage, the specialization, intellectual property, and economies of scale and scope decide the modern trade. You have to justify this statement with the real example of Japanese company, the real example of Chinese company, how they have competitive cost advantage through the process of large scale production they enjoy. The Japanese company, the Chinese company, through the large scale manufacturing, they have reduced the unit cost of production so low, they create a artificial entry barrier for other country to produce that commodity at that particular level of price, because it is not possible for them to produce that particular cost of production or price of the goods, so that they compete with the Japanese company or Chinese company. So, artificially the scope, the large economies of scale, large economies of scope, they created an artificial barrier for other company to enter. Similarly, we can discuss about intellectual properties of US. how through the innovation process they got the intellectual property in pharmaceutical sector, many goods and services sector, and they are now commanding the world trade. So, similarly you can discuss about the specialization, developing and the specialization also influence the world trade. You can discuss here the many emerging country, through their labor forces, high specialization they created, they are exporting the labor forces, they are creating a labor market, specialized labor market, and commanding the world resources, commanding the international trade. Here you can discuss about the specialization process. You can also discuss about competitive advantage in natural resources like South Africa, many African country, many emerging country like India, China, because of the natural resources they also command competitive advantage. However, natural resources need to be productively utilized, the production process needs to be started from there itself. However, through exporting the mineral resources they cannot get the competitive advantage. You discuss about the competitive advantages side of natural resources and factor endowment. Similarly, you can discuss about the pattern of trade depends upon the contribution of the government in the form of law, in the form of environment for industry to develop, in the form of reform measures, that through taxation principle, through the principle of subsidy, through the providing infrastructure facility, all these things influence the international trade and modern trade side. All these things you have to discuss in this third question, because international trade is not a particular theory has not developed to describe everything about international trade. All theory combined together can only justify what actually behind the international trade. Thank you.